James Bond pose, right?
So I'm assuming I'm James Bond in
Oh,
this
yeah.
scenario.
Okay. You got to wear a suit to be James Bond, Mark.
Hacker James Bond.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. We are the last thing between you and drinks. And today we're going to kind of talk about the reason that we're all here today. We have some fantastic products, our unified security platform, but at the end of the day, it's to help you and your customers defend yourself against the state of cybersecurity. You do kind of know me and Mark, but we do have new roles at WatchGuard. We've been a long time part of WatchGuard Threat Lab, sharing research, but recently we're also the CISO office. So I run the security with Mark as my operations. Mark, did you want to talk
And
about
while
yourself a little?
Corey's in meetings all day, I do all the actual work.
And I get paid the big bucks. So today we're going to talk about the threat you're all facing. We're going to split it up into two things. One is kind of just industry concerns, things that are happening in governments and in just technology trends, and other things that are affecting the state of cybersecurity. But then we're going to cover some of the top threat evolutions. We're not going to go into a ton of detail. We'll do some of that in the tech track later on, but we'll cover 4 major threats and dive into them a little. And as you can tell, me and Mark have a lot of silly banter. I'm kind of the old grumpy guy he tries to make fun of. I
I have
do
the
dad jokes. He
best job
cringes.
in the world. All I do is make fun of this guy all day at work. It's fantastic.
So we'll try to keep that up with some silly
Yeah,
dad jokes.
please
And by
no.
the way, to me, making Mark cringe is even better than making Mark laugh. So let's dive into the industry concerns first. And we'll go ahead and start with the first one, which is basically geopolitical cyber tensions. Right now we're in a state of industry where, I used to say, Mark and I used to talk about state-sponsored actors who have been around since Stuxnet. But we used to say they probably wouldn't target small businesses. That has changed. Now state-sponsored actors are targeting small businesses. If you just think about Cyclops Blink, for example. So one of the first things that have happened recently we all know about is unfortunately the Ukraine war with Russia. But this is having ramifications in cybersecurity as well. So obviously in February of 2024, 2022, Russia physically attacked Ukraine. But before they did that, they actually started with what has become their MO, tons of digital attacks. I would say the 3 most common things they do, one is simple distributed denial of service. They're always going after government sites, but also a lot of private organizations, things like critical infrastructure, energy, banks, all of that is privately owned, but it's critical infrastructure to your economy and your government. So they go after those sites with DDoS attacks. Another big trend is wiper malware, often disguised as ransomware. Wiper malware is pretty much there to destroy computers at banking sites and things like that. But they pretend like it's ransomware, but in reality, those files aren't recoverable. And finally, there's a lot of targeted phishing going on. But this was not just a Ukraine thing. Ever since that started, 2022 has seen a rise of 250% in Russian-based cyber attacks across the world. 300% on NATO sites or NATO countries specifically. There's a lot of collateral damage happening in the EU where they're targeting other countries besides just Ukraine as well. Another thing that has blown up, hacktivism. Who remembers Anonymous and old school hacktivism in 2010? Yeah, we followed LulzSec and stuff like that, but they have really disappeared for the last decade. But part of this cyber war in Ukraine has increased hacktivism. It's not just Ukrainian, state-sponsored actors and Russian state-sponsored actors. It's people around the world that have an opinion on who should win this war, also doing those cyber attacks. I will say there's some positives to this change too. One positive is Ukraine has remained pretty resilient. They haven't suffered any huge damage from this. Another real cool trend is governments around the world, intelligence agencies, now realize the threat in a war to private organizations. So they're starting to declassify materials and share them with private organizations to help them protect themselves earlier. So those are some of the good things. But there are some other trends as well.
Yeah, a lot of these geopolitical trends are spilling over into consumer applications as well too. It was back in March of this year, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union all started banning TikTok on federal or government issued devices because of security concerns around that space. And we're starting to see that pick up and potentially forced bans in for end user consumers as well too. Back in the states, just last week, we now have the very first of our 50 states that has banned TikTok on even just consumer devices within their region as well too. Now, how effective that's actually going to be, I'll give a plug for our podcast. It's coming out today, I think.
Yeah, Monday
Check it out, and you'll get
in the
our
US.
opinion on that one. But the reality is, like, we're starting to see more concerns around consumer applications on federal devices, on our devices. There are genuine security or data privacy concerns around these, even if you're ignoring some of the actual geopolitical influence that you could potentially get from these apps. And at a minimum, it's causing everyone, business folks, end users, my friends that work as like nurses and bartenders, to start questioning the security of these applications. Like, security is top of mind for everyone these days.
Yeah. By the way, hey, Mark, what are a CISO's top 2 cybersecurity fears?
What?
Everyone that works outside of the organization and everyone that works inside the organization.
Yeah.
Dum-tsh.
Accurate. That was bad.
Everyone. Really, that's just a transition to the third trend, by the way, which is insider threats. We are starting to see governments warn the world, their citizens. CISA did an alert here in the US recently, warning about state-sponsored countries trying to get insider threats into companies to steal intellectual property. Something that's happened for a while, but one that they're increasingly concerned with now. One example of this, by the way, if you go to YouTube and you search Made in Beijing FBI, they released an interesting video where apparently, agriculture is very competitive. Everything's genetically modified now to get crops that really grow very well in one location. So they, in that video, show a situation where a Chinese-born person came here, went to a technical college in the United States, and brought his whole family over here and lived here for 20 plus years, was part of one of these high-tech agricultural companies, and was a trusted friend of the CIO or CEO. And over time, it turned out he was actually sharing intellectual property about this agriculture company with the Chinese government. And his goal was actually to become famous as a researcher in China. And luckily he was caught, but it's just one example. And there's many more. The FBI is not even immune. About a while ago, one of their female agents from Kansas City turned out to work there for 12 years, was stealing confidential information too. So as scary as this all sounds, there is opportunity in this storm. All these scary things we talk about do have silver linings that we can take advantage of. And one of the things is cybersecurity is top of mind. I mean, almost every mass media news organization talks about some kind of cyber threat, talks about the TikTok problems, talks about privacy. So it's no longer us having to convince small businesses that you have to worry about this. It's starting to really become regular for sure.
My grandmother is literally sending me text messages of her fishing wins every time she spots one these days. This is where cybersecurity is at right now.
So the next big concern is increasing regulation and compliance, starting with government regulation. This has existed for a while. I think we all know privacy is something governments have really focused on. Everyone knows about GDPR. There's a Gartner statistic that says by the end of this year, 2023, 65% of the world population's personal information will be protected by a modern privacy law like GDPR. Why is that a big deal? In 2020, only 10% of our information was protected. So privacy is a big concern. By the way, everyone's seen the new Facebook Meta news? It also has major teeth. If you haven't seen, Facebook Meta just got a fine of $1.3 billion because they said they were exporting some of the European data to the US for analysis. So they're going to appeal that, but obviously this regulation has a lot of teeth.
You're saying Facebook isn't good with data privacy?
Exactly.
Color me shocked.
Don't worry, just use TikTok instead. They'll be fine. So really though, privacy is not the most recent trend in this regulation. One thing we're seeing lately has started to happen in a lot of countries, but really only happened in March 2023. Joe Biden's White House released a new cybersecurity strategy document that had 5 different pillars. And I won't talk about all of them, but the third pillar in particular was the government's desire to shape the cybersecurity market to be more cybersecure and resilient. And the main way they're doing that can be seen in 3.3 of that particular pillar, where they actually want to transition the liability or the risk of software flaws from consumers. Because if you think about it, if there was a flaw in software, consumers would get bit, but companies have not been liable. The EULA just says, hey, it's your responsibility. Governments now want to transition that to the vendors that create these software products and services, which, even though we're a vendor, is an understandable thing. If vendors aren't doing a good job, you need them to actually do better. And this isn't just a US trend. For instance, Australia did it a month before. Their prime minister released a very similar cybersecurity strategy that also had some of this. So you can enjoy more of these type of regulations coming out. By the way, hey, Mark.
Oh, no.
What does a hospital gown and cybersecurity insurance have in common?
I don't know.
They never cover as much as you hope.
Stop. It's not just, oh man, it's not just regulations too. Like we're seeing compliance come across the board, especially being driven by cyber insurance these days. So up until like 2020, 2021, cyber insurance providers were just hemorrhaging money. They were paying out ransomware demands without any long-term actuaries of knowing just how painful that was going to be for them. And since then, 2021, 2022, and now going into here, we're seeing them jack up premium rates quite extensively, and also the requirements for cyber insurance too. How many of you have gone through a policy renewal in like the last year? It's not very fun these days. There's an extraordinary list of requirements. They're not even validating, do you have MFA enabled everywhere? It's what type, what vendor, how are you deploying it? They're going to do audits against your organization to make sure that you are actually following along with the requirements. Like they do a pretty good job of just basic attack surface management, or at least visibility for the companies that they're trying to provide insurance for. And this is driving cybersecurity adoption across the board. Because at the end of the day, without cyber insurance, it's extremely difficult to recover from a substantial data breach or even just security event. It's not just the downtime, it's the cost of bringing people in. And we're seeing this really start to force organizations to, they themselves come to you and say, hey, we need X, Y, and Z in order to secure our company.
And Mark covered the opportunity there. Really, if you think about it, what has always driven security more than anything? It's not us warning that a house could burn down. It's compliance. It's someone forcing them to do it. In the past, it was PCI DSS. In the US, it's things like HIPAA for healthcare. And those regulations are global as well in different ways. But this is actually a good thing. This regulation will force all software vendors and security vendors to get better. And the insurance, it's going to be a pain in the butt for your end users, but they're going to come to you now and say, I can't get insurance. It costs too much. I need to have this thing called EDR I haven't even heard of. I need to turn MFA on remote access or they're not going to insure me anymore. So it's a very good way to drive business. The other thing about the privacy regulation, by the way, if you're good at it, all of these risks, if you're a company or a partner that is good at it, that has a privacy policy, that has a trust center like WatchGuard Trust Center, and that does things to prove you're trustworthy, it can become a competitive feature, something you compete in when everyone has similar check marks. So the next thing we want to talk about is third-party risk. Everyone is starting to figure out that third-party risk is a very important part of everyone's cybersecurity strategy. And this is really driven by the rise of digital supply chain attacks. I think you've all heard what these are. SolarWinds is the easiest example to mention. When they had a huge hack, they obviously are a well-used company that has things like Orion, an IT monitoring service that was very popular. When their company got breached, the bad guys made it all the way into the source code servers and were able to Trojanize the legitimate installer. And that's by far not the first time it's happened. There's been many others, Perforce, CCleaner, stuff like that. But these keep happening. In 2021, these rose threefold compared to before. So some examples. How many people have heard of Latitude? Probably not many here unless you read international news. They're an Australian company. They're a credit loan payment provider. If you ever go to the Apple store and you want to pay for something on a loan or credit or pay as you go at Apple in Australia, you'll be using Latitude. They recently had a breach. The breach, the same old story. They lost about 8 million driver's licenses for Australian folks, about 53,000 password numbers, which are even a worse thing to lose. And I think it was something like 6.7 million full personal records of address, email, and stuff like that. But why are we talking about this breach from March 15th? It's because Latitude claims that it was a major third-party provider that allowed the attack to happen. And the rumor is a company called DXC, which is a US-based company. But that's just one example.
Yeah, it's not the latest. In fact, when we were getting ready to present this at Apogee in the Americas, there was another one that came fresh off the press. And in fact, the 3CX supply chain attack that occurred towards the end of that month allowed us in the industry to coin an entire new type of term for this. It's a cascading supply chain attack. So if you're not familiar with it, 3CX is a very popular VoIP provider, VoIP software provider, and their desktop application was weaponized to, through the normal update mechanism, deliver a information stealer to their customers' endpoints. And during their investigation, they brought in Mandiant, and they found that actually 3CX themselves had been the victim of a supply chain attack through a piece of financial software that they used within their organization. And the threat actors in this case, which all signs point to North Korea, were able to identify where they were at, say, oh, wow, this is a good opportunity, and then expand their supply chain attack even more. And this is just the reality we're in right now. Like, it doesn't make sense to go after individual organizations with all of your resources when you can pick one big software manufacturer that a lot of people use, hit them, and then suddenly explode your blast radius immensely.
And we pick on like these private providers, but do you know open source projects? There's lots of different ways these kind of digital supply chain attacks have happened. So what's happening? What's the result of this? Well, the industry is now focusing on things like third-party risk management, TPRM, or even supply chain risk management, SCRM. If you want to, there's too many freaking acronyms, so there's two more for you guys to memorize.
Someone in security gets promoted every time we come up with an acronym.
Exactly. That's how Gartner makes money. It just makes new acronyms. And as you can see, 71% of organizations say the amount of third-party applications in their networks just continues to increase. And you think about things like our SaaS adoption. That's all a third-party application you're sharing data with. So it makes sense that this is blowing up. And it's made a whole new industry around systems and processes that help you validate third-party risk management, which I think Marc will talk about.
Yeah, and so if you follow our content from the Threat Lab, every November or so, we put out our security predictions for the coming year, where we try and track specific trends that we are seeing and identify where they're going to end up. And one of our predictions for this year, which was a bit of a no-duh one, I felt like at the time, was that organizations, managed service providers like you, your end users, they're going to see the security posture and practices of vendors and suppliers as one of the major factors in the purchasing decision, right behind price and performance. And this is really starting to become true. One of the responsibilities that Corey's and my team have is responding to these vendor validation requests from our partners, our customers. I will say I'm getting tired of hearing Corey complain about the 1,000-question Excel spreadsheets, so please do something a little more efficiently than that.
A management system to help you run them through an official system.
Exactly.
And maybe count it when vendors have good certifications that will answer most of those questions for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely, I can tell you personally, this has increased for us. I presume if you run an MSP service, some of your customers are going to ask you about your security practices before trusting you. And this, between partners, customers, we're seeing tons of these questionnaires. To Marc's point, the industry, or at least people starting to adopt it, are pretty immature at it. Like they might go and grab one common questionnaire is called SIG. If you look up SIG, they have different types of questionnaires of security questions you can ask a vendor to see how they handle certain things. And we see that 1,024, the full SIG, they don't even go and look at what you do. They just send you that full questionnaire in an Excel document. Why does that irritate me? No one's going to read the answers. Are they really looking at it and grading all those answers if they're just copying the SIG? There are systems out there, OneTrust is one we use, that actually will cater questionnaires towards your concern. And we'll also pay attention to things like, does the organization have something like ISO 2701 certification? Or are they SOC 2 Type 2 certified? And right away, if someone goes through an audit for that certification, there's there's hundreds of basic questions you don't have to ask them about backup and things like that, because they never would get an ISO certificate, at least for the scope of what they cover, without doing that. And that is the opportunity here, by the way. While it is more work for security teams and even you to respond to these for your customers, if you're the one they trust, if you do this well, you become trustworthy to them. And trust is really what is going to help you sell security. So let's talk about another trend, but hey, Marc,
Oh no. Yeah.
what do you call an AI device that takes a picture of itself for the first time?
What?
Selfie aware.
Get off the stage.
AI is another huge trend. I think you can't read an article in Wired without hearing about AI. I think you all have heard of ChatGPT 3 and now 4, which uses natural language processing. Talking about predictions, I would say years ago, I think 3 years ago, that was when natural language processing wasn't quite as sophisticated as now, but it was getting better.
Not quite as sophisticated. You're giving it a lot more credit than it was horrible back then.
Yeah, we went to a DEF CON talk where for fun, researchers gave AIs prompts to write something like movie scripts or stories.
It was gibberish. It was hilarious.
It was hilarious gibberish, but it was gibberish. But now, if you've used ChatGPT 4 and you tell it to write something, I know why movie writers and script writers are striking right now. It is actually very, very smart, which leads to, of course, doing things like automating spear phishing, which was our prediction years ago. This is definitely starting to happen already because of things like ChatGPT being out there in the public now. One example, I think they call themselves the Singapore Government Defense Group. They did a research test where they took 200 people in their own organization, their coworkers that they knew. They took 200 people, and they wrote 200 spear phishing emails by hand themselves. And they also got ChatGPT 3 to write 200 spear phishing emails. Who can guess which ones got more clicks? AI, ChatGPT got more clicks for their own coworkers who they knew about. So it's a very big deal. One other thing, if you think about the automation, the scale automation of what AI can help for spear phishing, which typically is manual. Not even talking spear phishing. Who thinks it's crazy that Nigerian scam emails work? To me, they're so freaking obvious. Why would you even do it? Because no one's going to click on that, right? Well, guess what? The threat actors that started that did that on purpose. They know that it's a bad lure. Guess what they're trying to do? They're trying to find the gullible people. If you are one that follows a Nigerian type scam, they already know you may not be as logical as some folks. But the reality is for these scams, it's not just one click that gets a scam. They have to interact with the person that clicks on the scam email. They have to get you to buy gift cards, go to your bank and open an account. There's a lot of back and forth that happens. That is costly. That's why there's some Indian-based literal scam centers, call centers, and Nigerian email centers that have people 24/7 ready to answer your call or your email so that they can perpetrate this. Very heavy resource. Not anymore. ChatGPT is really smart, even at running with the punches of the weird responses to victims. So it really is going to help things like email threats.
Yeah, and it's not the only thing that artificial intelligence is going to drastically change in the coming years. So I am going to say something that I think differs a little bit from some of my colleagues in the industry. I'm not actually personally concerned about ChatGPT itself writing malware. Like it writes technically functional malware, including ransomware and remote access Trojans, but they're all very rudimentary and relatively easy to catch. They don't typically work very well. There's not a whole lot of good encryption. But that's okay. Like ChatGPT and Bard, they're not designed to write malware. They are designed to mimic the conversations of a human being. They are large language models. Unfortunately, there are other forms of machine learning and AI that were designed to write software. So in March of 2021, GitHub released a tool that they call Copilot, and it's a plugin for your code editor. And it basically, you give it a small little prompt of what type of code you want it to write. Like, give me a function that updates this user record, deletes this one, and increments this number over here. And it will full spit out a perfectly working bit of code in whatever programming language you're working in. This already exists. It's been around for years. And that style of machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to be what's going to be abused in order to create malware at scale within our industry.
Yeah, and that is the very scary stuff, but even basic stuff, what you're seeing on the picture there is the breach.to dark web form that's now been kind of taken over by the FBI, but at the time, they actually got AI to write some basic Trojan code, so it's already doing it. So what is the opportunity here? Well, security companies like us have to use AI to automate. You know, as scary as it is, everyone talks about Skynet. I don't think AI will go sentient anytime soon.
I do.
That's because he is an AI, by the way. Watch out for him. He's a robot. But I will say, you know, machine versus machine is probably where security is going to go. Another cool DEF CON talk that me and Marc went to, I think it was in 2016, was funded by DARPA, and it was called the Grand Cybersecurity Challenge. And they gave a standard network they wrote network applications that weren't known, but ones that did basic things. Everyone got the same application, and they had to write a machine learning or AI platform that real time would both try to find vulnerabilities in the application on other people's network servers, while also finding and fixing their own vulnerabilities. So really, the future of security will be heavily AI-driven. And our product already uses it. One of the best features of WatchGuard EPDR is the Zero Trust Application Service. If you were a Panda person, it was also called the Attestation Service, where if we've never seen a file before and you're in full lock mode, we're not going to let your user run it until we know for absolute sure that it's goodware or badware. And while at the end of the day, a very small portion, it's like 0.2% go to human analysts, that zero-day application or zero trust application service is heavily driven by machine learning to detect new malware kind of at line speed. So moving on, oh, the animation's gone on this one. But the next issue, Michelle kind of highlighted, which is the cybersecurity skills shortage or skills gap. This is getting bigger. This is the simple fact that our field has blown up. Our field of cybersecurity is huge, and we can't hire experienced people fast enough to keep up with the need. This is the latest numbers, I think, from ISSA that talks about how many global jobs we have not filled. And you can see it's about 3.5 million if you round up a little bit. 3.4 million jobs have not been filled in 2022 because of this skills gap. And it's continuing to grow often year over year. I think the US version of this is there's about 700,000 jobs open right now.
And even when you have one of these jobs filled, it's often difficult to retain that talent too. I actually just came from an event focused on mid-market organizations at the end user level. And one of the biggest trends there was, yeah, you know, we hired a security analyst, but they were out the door 6 months later after we got them all trained up. It's difficult. And even at the leadership level too, the outlook isn't a whole lot better. Gartner just put out a study a few months ago that found just about almost 50% of cybersecurity leadership is going to leave their job within the next 2 years. And half of those, so 25% in total, are going to leave the industry entirely. And this is a pretty big risk for most organizations. I say most organizations because if you tell me that Corey's going to be gone, there's a 50% chance within the next 2 years. Like, I'll take those odds.
He wants to be the CSO, if you don't
But
know.
let's be real on this one, though. Like, it's a concern from everywhere down from the analyst all the way up to leadership. And this skills gap is difficult for our end users to address themselves, too.
Now, this is a challenge to us. Oh, that was weird. There's my animation. This is a challenge to us too, but it can also be an opportunity. If you can perfect getting cybersecurity, Michelle also mentioned that IT companies don't want, or normal companies don't want to deal with this. They just want to outsource cybersecurity. If you can be the trusted entity that has people that take care of it, if you work with vendors that help you automate it so you can actually take care of it with less high level, incident analysts and so forth, it's a great opportunity for you to say, hey, company, you don't need to worry about this. I will be your cybersecurity expert. And we're seeing more and more MSSPs and MSPs that are doing little, neat things like partnering with local community colleges or universities, offering some kind of, teaching or examples, and then offering internships to fresh college students to get kind of a hiring cycle. If you can do that, it's a very good opportunity for you as well.
And that same event that I talked about, almost every single business owner or IT leader that I discussed with says they're moving towards MDR or are already using some form of MDR. So it is definitely a space to grow into.
Absolutely. So those are some of the industry concerns, but let's go ahead and move on to the technology evolutions. And there's really only 4 kind of technological threats we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to really mention them here because we'll go into detail, so let's kind of move on. But before I get into this slide, Marc, what does a hacker's out of office message say?
I don't know, Corey. What?
Gone fishing. By the way, I'm not really telling the jokes. I'm actually doing a Pavlovian experience so that when I go home, every time I, hey, Marc, he's just going to cringe. It will just be a Pavlov response for him.
Jump out the window.
By the way, as I made that bad joke, who's been reading this slide? Anybody? Does it look okay? And can anyone find anything weird about it? Maybe the dates.
I'm so still a company.
That's true. I'm so lazy. Everything's from 2021. This slide is actually trying to show you some of the evolutions to business email compromise. I didn't write this slide. This was ChatGPT. It's very simple. If you need to go and play with it because it's really eye-opening if you use the tool yourself. I started with just write a short paragraph for me that talks about the latest evolution in spear phishing. The problem with ChatGPT 3 is it's limited to 2021 data, so pretty darn accurate result, but older information. I will say ChatGPT is very long-winded, kind of like me, so I had to go back and say, can you give me a shorter answer so I can put it on the slide? But then I also did, I did things like to give me some 3 bullets of stats, which it did. And I even said, ChatGPT, can you actually make me a slide? And as Marc mentioned, it's just natural language processing. So it's like, no, but here's exactly how you should lay out the slide. Here's the picture you should use with this statistic. It does everything for you. And that is really one of the major evolutions in business email compromise. So I do want to talk about business email compromise actually is the #1 threat. And it's weird because I'm a 25 plus security guy. Email compromises are so boring to me. If you think about it, it's how our industry started with emails with viruses attached to them. But the reason it's important to talk about them is to this day, they're the most common way for cyber attacks to happen. As you can see, according to one of our partners, Trend Micro, 90% of cyber attacks start with some sort of phishing email. 68% of those are actually spear phishing, so more targeted emails. Even malware infections, 94% of malware infections, according to Verizon Data Breach study that's released every year, 94% of malware starts with email delivery. So it's still a very big problem. The chart you see, by the way, comes from, as Prakash mentioned, me and Marc have a new relationship with the FBI, but this is something you can get from the Internet Crime Center, Complaint Center, IC3, which the FBI in US runs. And according to them, the one at the bottom, phishing and email threats are by far the worst threat. We talk about ransomware a lot, and I will be talking about ransomware soon, but really the most losses for cyber attacks in the US come from business email compromise. They say in the US in 2022, it was $2.7 billion lost because of it. Ransomware, 35 million with the M versus a B. So much more crime in phishing than anything else. And then the other thing we already alluded to, AI is really making phishing more and more sophisticated, and worse yet, automating spear phishing in ways that wasn't possible before. One of the interesting examples is they're getting pretty sophisticated with phishing. Uh, FBI talked about one phishing case where we know they already kind of spearfish C-level executives like Prakash or me. But what they did here is in the spearfish, which pretended to come from like the CEO, instead of a bad link, they had you join like a Teams or Zoom or Slack meeting, something you're used to doing in business nowadays thanks to the pandemic. When you joined that meeting, you were greeted, the CEO might be saying, hey, I need help transferring some money to an account for a partner. You had joined this Teams meeting. The CEO would mention that their camera's not working, but you'd have a picture of them, but you would hear their voice. Guess how they did that? They did it with deepfake software. So if your CEO or CSO has some voice online, it's pretty trivial to make deepfakes of that person's voice. And that interaction on Teams real time was how they actually did some financial theft from this particular victim. Speaking of deepfakes, by the way,
Yeah,
you have a cool podcast.
Any podcast listeners out there from us? So if you did not already listen to last week's episode, I actually tried my best to kick Corey off, maybe permanently, we'll see, and did an interview with ChatGPT, fed that transcript into a voice deepfakes software that I licensed for like $5 for the month. And it does an amazing job. And the overall content was really interesting too, learning from ChatGPT itself what its thoughts were on AI usage within cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And one more thing I wanted to hit on. So we're talking about business email compromise, but the reality is spear phishing these days is evolving past just email too. Like I am getting, feels like almost monthly text messages from Prakash here asking me to go buy him some Apple gift cards. And I'm getting really
Come on,
sick of them
Prakash,
because it's
QFC's just down the street.
costing me a lot of money to go do this all the time. But I mean, I joke, but that it works. Like the reason that we're getting these text messages and WhatsApp messages out there is because there are victims falling for them. And I don't think as an industry are focusing enough beyond email as well too, and teaching our users how to spot social engineering no matter what communications medium it comes through.
Yep. So what's the takeaway or opportunity here? Well, the good news is we have tons and tons of protection for email type attacks. One of the first is AuthPoint, multi-factor authentication, which Carla will talk about in the tech track. Because phishing is often trying to get credentials, MFA really, really helps. But then things like DNS watch for malware. If people do accidentally click a booby trap link, whether it's phishing or a drive-by download, DNS watch is that kind of safety net that might catch them. EPDR, the malware services on the Firebox, really there's endless opportunities. Before we move to the next one, hey, Mark.
What?
After years and years of cybercrime, how did the cybercriminal get into heaven?
How?
They didn't change their password for 2,000 years.
Okay. That was actually kind of a good one.
Transition to MFA.
It's not just so when it comes to these like business email compromise attacks and social engineering in general, more often than not, they end up with a compromised credential of some sort. So we're seeing these days most breaches, 50% of lost or stolen credentials were used in breaches at some point in the last year, according to the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. You can get it from a phish. You can buy it off the underground. There was an entire threat actor organization, and I'm using organization loosely. It was a bunch of teenagers in the United Kingdom that for about a year from 2021 into 2022 were plaguing massive organizations like Microsoft, I think Epic Games or Rockstar Games, like big companies with pretty substantial data breaches. And how they were getting in was purchasing credentials off the underground or going to just some low-level employee in those companies and paying them money to give up their username and password. So these days, one of my favorite quotes from Carla, if she's in the room, is attackers, they don't break in, they log in. And that makes sense. Why would you waste your time trying to find a vulnerability in an application, try and exploit that vulnerability, deploy your malware, whatever, when you can just go on the underground or go to the lowest ranking employee, get a set of credentials from them, and log straight in. Now, the good news is multi-factor authentication is an extremely powerful tool for protecting against stolen credentials. It's one of the single best defensive controls that you can put in place to protect against a lot of authentication attacks. Unfortunately, multi-factor authentication on its own is not omnipotent. What I mean by that is we're starting to see threat actors change their techniques and use more advanced social engineering tactics that can even circumvent multi-factor authentication. For those of you that are in the technical track upstairs tomorrow, I'm actually giving a demo of a commoditized version of one of these more advanced, sophisticated techniques called evil proxy and show you exactly how it works and the potential impact for people that fall victim to it. So if you're in the tech track, congratulations. If you're in the business track, sorry, we get all the fun stuff upstairs, I guess.
Obviously, as Marc pointed out, the opportunity, auth point for sure. But if you do see his tech track demo and see how tools can help you do a man in the middle, sometimes that man in the middle requires things like browser in the middle, where WatchGuard EPDR and other endpoint security can help as well. Hey, Marc.
No.
One more, just one more.
What?
Where did the cybersecurity team disappear to during a major breach?
Where?
They ran somewhere.
Boo.
I love it. More cringe.
Why are you? Don't encourage him.
So obviously, we're kind of sick of talking about ransomware, but as Prakash pointed out in his presentation, it's a huge moneymaker. Beck might be the way they breach companies, but the payload of choice to make money is definitely ransomware. We know you know a ton about it, so we're not going to go a ton into evolution, but to kind of pimp our own report, the Internet Security Report is something Marc and I do with our team every quarter. And last quarter, which was Q4 2022, after seeing kind of ransomware plateau and go down, it suddenly exploded again. We saw a 627% rise in ransomware among our endpoint security products, EPTR and AD360. So it really is a huge increase. And by the way, we talked about cybersecurity insurance. The whole reason premiums have shot up and the reason they're doing all this compliance is because of ransomware. Their main strategy for it was just to pay the extortion. If a company didn't have a backup and you had cyber extortion insurance, they would pay. Guess what? They lost money. If you do things like that without long-term actuary tables and you feed cybercrime, you're going to lose money. And that's what happens. As you can see, 34% of cyber insurance claims in the first half of last year were due to ransomware. Now, what can we do for this? I would just talk about the WatchGuard Unified Security Platform. Ransomware has lots of vectors. Everything we talked about, from phishing to drive-by downloads to something Marc will get into, is a way to deliver it. So use that full security platform. It's why you definitely want to have a lot of it. But things like Threat Sync and XDR, our MDR service, and the threat hunting capability we're going to do are also going to help you catch ransomware. And with that, let's get into the last trend, which is... There we go. The animation works after the first
Apparently
slide.
this thing's infected with malware too. So these days, like delivering malware and getting it onto a machine, they're using more sophisticated techniques that makes it really difficult for traditional endpoint protection to identify a lot of these threats. So Corey mentioned our report. One of the things we track is how malware originates on an endpoint. And for the past few quarters, around 90% of the malware threats that we saw at the endpoint started with a script. And around like 99% of those were PowerShell specifically. So threat actors are using techniques called living off the land tactics, where they're using the applications built into our operating system, like scripting interpreters and different applications, in order to do everything malicious that they need to. There's entire toolkits built around this in PowerSploit, things like PowerSploit, PowerWare, where you don't even need a whole lot of development or software engineering experience in order to write a highly evasive malware threat that can inject itself into the memory of another process and execute all without ever touching the file system on an endpoint. And one of the things Corey likes to point out is back in the day when someone in your house when someone would pick up the phone and it knocks off one of your family members from the internet, a really popular attack delivery technique was using .lnk files and .hta files on email messages. Anyone know what a LNK file is off the top of their head? Yeah, it's a shortcut. You know, something that's typically a couple of kilobytes in size or so. Typically. Now we're seeing threat actors weaponize shortcut files and deliver them via email to victims. They're like tens of megabytes in size now. They've got embedded applications in them, so when you click on them, it actually looks like it's opening a PDF, a legitimate PDF, but in the background, it's running PowerShell to decode and decrypt a ransomware payload and execute that on the system too. These techniques, there's entire toolkits for free on GitHub that can help you create one of these weaponized payloads. And this transition is really because Microsoft, to their credit, has done a pretty good job in the past few years of defanging Office-based malware, which is how we used to see a lot of these threats start to originate on an endpoint. It's actually pretty difficult these days to get someone to intentionally execute a macro-based Office document that they receive via email. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult. And that's why we're seeing threat actors pivot to these old, kind of resurgent types of delivery mechanisms.
And the opportunity here, if you come to my tech track tomorrow, not quite as cool a hacking demo as Marc does, but I will be talking about living off the land attacks. I'll be showing a live example of one of these link files. And more importantly, I'll be showing how really the EDR capabilities of WatchGuard EPDR can catch some of the things like malicious PowerShell, even without signatures. So that's it for me and Marc. Thankfully, you can get the drinks maybe 30 seconds late, but thank you so much for your attention.